Hi everyone, in this quick mix tip, we're going to be covering how we can sync up our reverb, pre-delay and decay times to the tempo of our track. So before we dive straight in, firstly what I'm going to do is I'm going to clear up some of the basics of reverb and where the different parts of reverb come from. So what I've got here is I've got a mock-up of a hall or a room, and I've also got the reverb device, which I'm going to be using a clap sample, and I've also got a little chart showing you the reverb over time. So we start off with our clap in the corner, and then we've got our pink dot, which is representing our listening position. And as you can see, we've got the direct sound, which is this blue arrow, and you can see that's also now in the graph as well. So that's the direct sound, so it goes straight from the sound source to the listener's ears. After the direct sound, what we have is we have the sound going from the sound source in every direction, so it's going to bounce off of all of the four walls, the floor and the ceiling, and then it's also going to reach the listener. And because it's not taking a direct route, it's an ever so slightly indirect route, it's going to have a little bit of a delay, and this would be the pre-delay time. And then after these early reflections, which can be thought of as the fairly distinct echoes, what we have is we have a more diffused sound, which is where the sound waves are bouncing off multiple surfaces before reaching the listener. So they're taking a very indirect route and they're getting quite diffused, and then they're just coming out as one sort of blurred, reverberated sound. And these are known as the late reflections. So as you can see there, we've got four main elements that make up a sound. We've got the direct sound, we've then got the pre-delay, we then have the early reflections, and then we have the late diffused reflections. So if we move either the listener or the sound source around in our space, then we're going to get different results. So in this second example, what we now have is we have the sound source in the center of the room. So this means the direct sound is still going straight to the listener, but our early reflections have got a lot more distance to travel to reach the nearest wall and then head back to the listener. And this distance means that the time is going to take longer, and it's going to be our pre-delay. So what this means is we have a bit of separation between the direct sound and our early reflections. This sort of stuff will change slightly depending on where the listener and where the sound source is, but generally speaking, a larger pre-delay is going to define a larger listening space, and where we are within the room and where the sound source is within the room is going to determine how the cluster of early reflections is spread out. So this is all quite important stuff to be able to understand, because people that don't know how to use reverb properly will jump straight for the decay time to try and choose how big their space is going to be or where they want to put stuff in their mix. However, if you think about it carefully, the size of your room and where things are placed in your room is actually determined a lot more by the pre-delay and the early reflections. And the late reflections are actually a lot more to do with what the surfaces are like and how reflective they are, and the actual shape of the room and the diffusion network. So bear that in mind. When you want to create a space, you should be thinking a lot more about the early reflections and pre-delay because of how they affect the sound and how your brain picks up on them. So now we're going to go into a little bit more detail on pre-delay. So it's got quite a few different uses, and the first one, which I've already covered slightly, is to help us locate a sound source within a space and also locate ourselves within a space. So going back to my example from earlier, if we've got the listener in one corner and the sound source in the opposite corner, then what we're going to have is we're going to have effectively no pre-delay, because the early reflections and the late reflections are going to get to the listener at a pretty similar time or just slightly after the direct sound source. So it's going to sound really distant and really far away and washy, and it's not going to have a great amount of clarity. Whereas on the other hand, if we have a longer pre-delay, it's going to make the sound really upfront as if it's close to the listener. And then those early reflections are going to have to go back. They're going to bounce all the way to the rear walls, and then they're going to bounce back, and that's going to give us a longer pre-delay. So this is really useful when we want to add intelligibility or clarity to vocals, or if we have any parts that we want to make them sound like they're in a space, but we still want them to be nice and upfront, then this is how we do it, by using pre-delay. So general practice is that a lot of producers will add as much pre-delay as they can get away with without the reverb splitting away from the actual sound, because of course they want as much clarity and sort of an upfront sound as they can get. But what we're going to cover now is why we should tempo sync our pre-delays as well. So to demonstrate why we should tempo sync our pre-delays, what I'm going to do is I'm going to load up a reverb, and I'm going to completely remove our late reflections. So we've just got the early reflections now and the direct sound. And as you can hear, if I just change this pre-delay, we can hear a very distinguished early reflection cluster. So instead of just trying to set this by ear, what we'll actually do is we'll get a bit mathematical and we'll do it properly with a formula. So we can either do this with a formula or we can do it with a pre-delay calculator online, but for now we'll do it properly. So what we'll do is we get 60,000, which is the amount of milliseconds in a minute, and we divide this by our project tempo, which is 120 beats per minute. So that's 60,000 divided by 120, and this gives us the amount of milliseconds per beat. So assuming that we're in a 4x4 time signature, which we are, this is going to equal 500 milliseconds per beat. And then what we do is we subdivide that as required. So in this case, I could divide it by 2, and that will give me an 8th note, which is 250 milliseconds. And I can divide it by 2 again, which will give me 125 milliseconds, which is a 16th note. And what we can do is we can even go tighter than that. And in this case, we want to get down until we're about maybe a 64th or 128th, which is going to give us around 31 or 15 milliseconds. So now that we've done this, as you can hear, it's sounding pretty good. So we can maybe bring in some of the late reflections again. And what I suggest you do once you've got this done is then you can readjust this by ear if you need to, because just because the formula says it's bang on doesn't mean it's necessarily going to fit your groove. So just adjust it tiny amounts, a few milliseconds at a time, either faster or slower, to fit the type of groove that you want to put onto your track. So it's up to you what sort of setting you want to use. The sensible ones to go for here would be 31.2 or 15.5, and obviously the 31.2 is going to sound more upfront, and the 15.5 or the 7.2 is going to sound much further back, like it's against the rear wall of the space that you're creating. So this technique is really good for helping our reverbs to blend in. Because it's tempo synced, it's going to sound like it's in rhythm and in time with the music, rather than just setting a random pre-delay time, which could give you a sort of off rhythm or triplet type feel that doesn't work with your groove. So this is all going to help tiny little adjustments to enhance your groove and make your reverb sound really good whilst keeping them quite subtle. So now that we've learned how to set our pre-delay times so that they're in sync with the tempo of our track, what we can do is we can do the exact same concept but with the reverb decay times as well. And something I want to really quickly mention here is that, like I said earlier, a lot of the new producers will go straight to the reverb decay time to try and create a big space. And the seasoned producers will know you can actually create a massive amount of space just using your pre-delay and your early reflections wisely. So before you go and you use a massive reverb decay time, think more carefully about the other settings first, so you don't end up washing out your entire track. But when you do decide you want to have a big decay time, what you need to be thinking about is how long is it going to take your reverb decay to die off below 60 decibels. This is known as the RT60, and once again we want to set this decay time, or RT60, so it's in time with the tempo of our track. So typically we're going to set this to either quarter a beat, half a beat, a whole beat, or maybe even 2 beats, so it dies off after each snare drum. Exactly the same as with the pre-delay, you might want to nudge this either slightly forward or slightly back, because the RT60, when it falls below the sort of noise floor of the rest of your track, is going to be subjective depending on how many instruments you have and how loud they are. So that's something to bear in mind as well. So just as a quick key point summary, we have our reverb, which is made up of a dry direct sound. If we turn the reverb on, we've got our early reflections. And we also have our late reflections, also known as our diffusion network. Both the early and late reflections aren't going to kick in till after the pre-delay. And if we have a large pre-delay, it's going to give us a nice upfront sound in a large space. So we can control the size of the room using this pre-delay. Using a shorter pre-delay is either going to give us a smaller space, or it's going to make the sound like it's much more further in the distance, like up against the back wall of the space. So what we need to think about doing is syncing the pre-delay up so it fits with the tempo of our track, and we can also do the same for the RT60, as I've done with these two parts here. By using this technique, what we can do is we can get a much larger sound without having to absolutely swamp the track in reverb, as I've done here. Thanks for watching this quick mix tip on syncing reverb times, and don't forget to subscribe for more videos.